Hey y'all. Today is going to be kind of not only exam review, but kind of just catch up with where we're at, what we're doing, a whole update. I am not sitting at my desk today because I've been grading this entire time. I've been adding the curves and whatnot, so hopefully many of you will be happy. I noticed you guys studied super hard and we got a ton of A's and B's this time around, so I was super proud. But we're going to go over this regardless. If you are unhappy with your grade, hopefully this helps. I would talk to me, shoot me an email before exam 3 to see what we can do. Also, try to remember it is not the end of the world, right? If you fail a class, I think people are stressing because it may be, either first or second semester for many of you. But talk to me and we can always, see what we can do. Make sure, remember there is an extra credit assignment. I would do that. It adds the same 3 points as if it were to any test. I'm specifically adding it to the first exam, but right, you can go over the first exam even if you made a 50 out of 50, get a 53 out of 50, and it will act towards your grade the same way if it were 3 points added to any exam. So let's get started. Question 1. Advancement of sound technologies. Charlie Chaplin makes more movies than ever before. Remember, this is false. They did have a production company, but he is known for his stuff in the silent era, his silent era style slapstick comedy, and he doesn't do better. He starts making less movies. At its deepest phase, Great Depression had about 25% unemployment. Remember, that was so incredibly rash, and we compared it to the unemployment that happened during our economic recession. Post-war period in the 1960s is not marked by interest in Cinerama over traditional movies. Remember when we were showing Cinerama, the whole point of that was how similar it looked, how forward-thinking it was, how similar it looked to like video games, and it looked like we were going on one of those like roller coasters type style rides, and how baffling it is seeing how forward-thinking it was and how popular that kind of stuff would be now, how it didn't take off. That was the surprising part about that. So we did have competing entertainment, the competing entertainment being television. We did have unprecedented births. We talked about the baby boom briefly. We did have more interest in leisure time activities. Those were all things going on. We didn't have interest in Cinerama. It didn't take off. Early Warner Brothers synchronized films were most well known for their, remember, we're about to have a question later in the exam that talks about later, once it's in like this classical era boom. Warner Brothers in the sync sound era that we're talking about, we had the two main companies we talked about, Warner Brothers and Fox, which was which. We went over this at least 3 times during the review, during the classroom reviews, when we were in class. Warner Brothers was musicals, Fox was newsreels, remember? Fox took newsreels because they had to, because most of the musical talent was bought up by Warner Brothers. And we'll have a question later, but I'll go ahead and talk about it now while I'm thinking about it, where the whole point, the really exciting thing about the synchronous sound was not music. They had music plenty of times before, and they had subtitles and they had narrators. It was that dialogue that you could see people moving actively with it, which is why, right, musicals maybe wasn't the best investment. But let's keep going. As a result of the Paramount decree, we had vertically integrated companies had to let go of their theaters. Theaters being exhibition, right? So if you knew they had to let go of exhibition, you know it's theaters. We didn't have horizontally integrated companies, remember, in the US. We talked about that in terms of France. Why does silent film last longer in Japan? I said there were 2 things. It is both A and B. Both Benshi narration was prestigious, and also they had a strong unionized workforce. Which of these were exemplified using Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window? It was both the 2 things we talked about was the Hitchcock coming to terms with aesthetics that referenced the impact of television technologies and the introduction of additional subcultural values into mainstream desires, both A and B for that one. Which of the countries led in synchronous sound? Remember I said you do need to know that. You don't need to know anything about USSR synchronous sound. You just need to know which ones they were. It was USSR, Germany, and US. France was not one of the leaders. National Recovery Administration was concerned with pro-labor interests and efforts over those of pro-business concerns. That was the most astonishing and the only example that we have here in the US of something that was both pro-business and pro-labor interests, right? And so if we say it was concerned with pro-labor interests and efforts over those, it wasn't. It was concerned with both, so that would be false. Which of these was not a major studio in the 1930s? Remember how last class we talked about the majors, and I asked you, I think 2 times, do you know RKO at all? Is it at all in your mind? You said no. RKO is the one that did not last as a major studio into the 1930s. Because cameras were constrained by the limitations of early sound technologies, all of the films in this period were stiff or immobile or clunky and poorly maneuvered. That one would obviously be false because I showed you 2 examples in class of how people got very creative with sound technologies and they weren't all clunky and stiff. And we talked about, I think, 3 or 4 examples. I gave you extra examples about how people use the technology. As a result of the Paramount decree, who benefited most? This would be movie stars. Oftentimes movie stars were running independent producers, but not all independent producers do well. Movie stars are the ones who already have the notoriety and fame, remember? And so that means that as soon as exhibition theaters open up, they're no longer blocked out to stifle competition. That means that movie stars, they have the fame, they now don't have that block, they can sell movies to exhibition, so movie stars tend to benefit the most. And that's also in your notes. All of these so far have been things I think explicitly taken from the notes, but I will let you know. Oh no, I guess not the movie one, but let's keep going. With synchronous sound, there was significant change to the developments in film style that were underway in the previous period. Which of these is not one of such changes? The answer is more frequent cuts. And remember, we showed, we were showing the stiffness of the technology. We talked about the change in aspect ratio. We talked about the slow blocking because they're scared to create a sound that might reverberate or hit in a bad way. The rigid cinematography because they're scared to move the camera equipment. They are not doing more frequent cuts because, again, they're scared of cutting the film strip in ways. They're trying to get it all in one take so that the band's playing off camera, all of the music goes in one take, right? So remember we showed that guy specifically and hilariously like bending down and the camera's not moving and it's also not cutting, right? It was so awkward. So yeah, more frequent cuts is not that. In the 1930s, being one of the majors in the film industry meant, remember we defined this at the very beginning, and we said now what being a major means is that they own a major theater chain and they're distributing internationally. Hays Production Code is... this is the one that I messed up. So I accidentally put 2 in there that it is. And so I think what I meant to do is not and put only, 1 or put is or is not and maybe put 3. I don't know what I meant to do. But both initially ineffective and outline suggested moral standards to be used in production are correct. Even I would even say probably drawn up to prevent official intervention because, right, that's the whole point of it. So maybe I did mean to do not and then enacted by the government, but I messed that one up entirely. This is why you got 0.125, right? Because if there are 40 questions on the test, that's 1 out of 40. But your grades are made 50 in there, so you get 0.125 to account for to be the same value as missing 1 question rather than 1 point. So let's move on. Synchronized sound films were originally called talkies because this is the one we were talking about earlier. The allure of dialogue is the main novelty in the sync sound narrative. They were originally applied to shorter newsreels and serial films, but they were also originally applied to musicals. So that one would be out. It's primarily used to narrate. It wasn't. Phonograph had to be played at the exact same time. That's only for sound on disc. If you're talking sound on film, that's not the case, right? Dialogue, and we talked about that. Dialogue is the main novelty. After the Paramount decree, distribution became lucrative due to, first of all, there are no production costs in distribution, so you can rule both of those out. So basically, why would it become lucrative? Are you super enticed by the idea of distribution because there's a lot of money you have to put in initially without being able? No, it's low sunk costs, right? So especially after the Paramount decree, that's just included to indicate why it would be so lucrative, because there are low sunk costs, and now you can ensure that you can sell to exit, because they're not trying to keep you out if you're not someone who's included in their production methods. So aesthetically, Cinerama films were more like video games. True. Which of these does not arise as a solution? And that's why I put that in italics, because all of these arised in the same period, right, as a change in film strips and sensitive sound equipment. The answer is bands that play just offset around the cameras. That was not a solution. In fact, that was a drawback, right, because it was so scary that any one of them could make some noise accidentally. The multi-camera system was a solution to some of the clunkiness. The black bars at the end was a solution to the change in film strips. So that first part of the question. The soundproof booths were also added as a solution to sensitive sound equipment. Gone with the Wind, the most prestigious picture of the 1930s, was produced independently. True. I said you needed to know this because it was so crazy, especially in that time in which we're moving towards let me go ahead and move on to the next question since I'm about to say that. In what decades does the movie industry hit the peak of all time? It's the 1940s. We're moving towards this era in which there's such a big budget now for movies, and it is incredible that an independent film would become the most prestigious picture of the 1930s, right? Especially when they're working to block out independent productions. So, early Fox synchronous sound films were most well known for their newsreel. We talked about that. They took on newsreel after Warner Brothers took musicals. In the classical era, see, this is classical era now, right? This is not early sync sound 20. This is classical being like 40s, right? Late 30s and 40s. Warner Brothers is well known for their relatively progressive social problem films. Remember, we talked about how they had gangster films, and they also, we used the example of Casablanca, how they would tackle political kind of strife that was going on in the time. Which of these is not one of the reasons film companies were hesitant to adopt sound technologies? Okay, so this one, remember, you are hesitant because there will be expense in exhibition. We talked about this at the beginning again. You have to change out all of the theaters to have all of the technologies to play synchronous sound. There will be expense in production. You have to change out technologies in order to be able to record sound. You do want to maintain standardization methods. So it is one of the reasons that film companies, because they want to be able to not have to expend all of that. That's essentially the expense in exhibition and production put together. There is no extra expense in distribution. So this is not one of the reasons that film companies are hesitant to adopt it. Which of these is not a trait of French cinema in early to mid-1930s that helped create the perfect climate for art and independent cinema to flourish? There are two ways you could do this. You could go to our notes and find out that weak studio system, low production budgets, and fragmented audiences with niche interests are reasons for that. Or you could simply do a Google search and say, when was France occupied, if you don't know? And you know that Nazi occupation doesn't happen until the 1940s. So this is not doing anything to stifle or help create the perfect climate. The climate is already created, but thank God it is by the time Nazi occupation happens, because that's because French cinema is still allowed to be produced, right? Both film noir and cheery domestic 50s television shows derive from the same post-war ideologies and its anxieties. True, this is the example that I used to show how is it that the aesthetic surface can look so different in class, and yet the underlying ideology be the same, it trying to perform the same function, right? In class, we were assigned the first 10 minutes of Bicycle Thieves. Which of these qualities did Bicycle Thieves not display? So again, there are two ways that you could think about this. You could go to our Italian neorealism notes, and you could see that Italian neorealism has on-location shooting. It has natural light. It has free-moving documentary styles of filmmaking. Or you could think back to when you watched the movie, right, if you did and you weren't, bullshitting and just thinking about Italian neorealism, which also works, by all means. And so you could think back to Bicycle Thieves, and you could say, was there a floating kind of narrative structure where it's theme-based and you're not really sure what's going on? There wasn't. It's clearly like, what happens? The guy gets the job. The guy loses his bicycle. Now they go, like, it's very A, B linear plot. It's not floating at all. It's very similar to what you know, which is why I assigned it. And so you could know that it's not displaying this floating theme-based narrative structure. In class, we were assigned the Children of Paradise, Baptiste pickpocket scene. This was used as an example of how French perceived their role in filmmaking at the time. What was the historical context in question? So this is seeing if you watched the entirety of my French lecture video, of course. And this is the part where we talked about the it was during Nazi occupation. It was expressing a theme of during Nazi occupation as their role as the silent messenger expressing the truth, because it was the mime, right, who couldn't say anything explicitly, but they had to use allegory. And we talked about how it's not like the Germans weren't catching on to these allegories in French production. It was that they didn't care. They thought they were going to win, right? What is the Screen Actors Guild? A labor union. It is still one of the biggest unions we have to this time. Government intervention was successfully pulling people out of the Great Depression. True. We talked about that. It was specifically not only due to wartime efforts and production. We talked about how all of those things that they were genuinely working, because we track it up until that point of time. And then, of course, the boom takes off once everyone can be enlisted into the army, and we have this army production that never really goes away. So, because it's such a big business, and we are hesitant to let go of those profits, right? An artist or stylistic qualities in the Baroque period of one artistic movement can also be an artist or qualities that belong to the experimental phase of another. This is true. In Italian neorealism, we used Antonioni. How he was criticized at the end of his period for starting to do these middle class type styles, and we talked about how before we start talking about New Wave, which is what we've been doing, how he's expressing many of these like New Wave type sentiments that weren't yet there, because it was still experimental for that. So. Which of these artistic movements does not necessarily center the working class? This one should be easy, because there are only 3 of these that we even talked about, and we never talked about French documentary. Even if French documentary does have working class people, it doesn't necessarily. It's a documentary film. It documents a specific thing in time, right? So Italian neorealism, poetic realism, and Soviet montage, we talked about how all 3 of those center the working class and how different they are in their strategies, right? Poetic realism specifically not even having any like formal set of qualities like Italian neorealism and Soviet montage do, even though none of the directors during either of them were, right, none of them were exactly the same in the way that they did things. So cinema's ontology for film theorist and Italian neorealist André Bazin would be the technology's representational quality. If we were talking about Soviet montage, remember they said it was editing, and we talked about the difference between the two, why they did each. André Bazin always talked about how, I remember we used art and photography, and how cinema was only getting closer to realism, which was important for them. So. Why would it be logically sound for Antonioni to move the formal and narrative focus from plainly presenting the working class people to criticizing middle class ones in order to continually warn against slipping back into the same fascist logics and its accompanying aesthetics that eventually bubbled up into World War II? The answer is there are growing middle-class sentiments in a growing post-war economy who no longer sympathize with the need for political change. So if the majority of the masses are no longer working class, struggling people, then who are you trying to depict as problematically, right? Who are you also trying to convince? It's these people. So it was strategy based on the political need at the time, based on the specific context that had changed since immediately post-war. Now, and we talked about how now all of these people were so excited because they were being included. They were starting to have this kind of American dream style. Well, look, we're all living comfortably, therefore nothing is wrong kind of thing, as everything was going back down the same road that had led to this situation, right? So poetic realism was a solidified movement with identifiable formal qualities and aesthetic traits. false. It is the only one that we can't list like we can in Italian neorealism and Soviet montage. Well, they tend to do this, that we don't have little bullet points from. It's very surrealist, just very poetic, very thematic, right? These are the only kind of like general things that we can say. It's one of those things that you kind of know it when you see it, and you know it because of the time period and what was going on, right? What is the Big Five agreement? Oh, I'm gonna have to read these. The agreement in which all 5 of the major studios chose a standardized method for producing and exhibiting sound technologies. The agreement in which all 5 of the major students chose a standard method for producing but not exhibiting sound technology. That's not true. The agreement in which all 5 of the major studios agreed not to capitalize on each other's markets. Not true. For sound technology moving out, they didn't agree not to. The agreement in which all 5 of the major students agreed not to patent, also not true. It's the first one. It's the agreement in which all 5 of the major students chose a standardized method for production and exhibition. Hollywood 10 are people within the industry who were blacklisted for not naming the names of others in the industry. That's the one. Remember, you should have been able to immediately rule out the people within the government part. The other one is people within the industry who are blacklisted for naming the names. If you go back to your note, because you're confused, it says in there because they resisted, right, the orders. In our lecture on Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, the mise-en-scène of the apartment buildings, where onlookers can quickly alternate their attention between the individual windows and the neighbors, that was used for television. I made that very explicit in class, so we'll move on. The point of consolidation, vertical integration, blind bidding, and block booking from the majors was to stifle outside competition. It's not to expand into alternative media markets, it's not to buy out other majors, and it's definitely not to make friends. 40, in Rear Window, the characters in a standard apartment building who all seem to take on different interests and leisure time activities, and the heroine, so this is the part that I'm giving you the context up until this point. This point is, and the heroine, who must now adopt adventurous qualities in addition to the classical beauty and culture previously expected of the love interest, acted as examples of what cultural change. This one, remember clearly we drew out the little like buckets at the bottom, and we said, this is the example of subculture, because now everyone has these like particular interests. So she can't just be this normal thing. She now has to take on something niche, right, in order to fit into, and the adventurous quality was the one that we named for that. So yes, we did talk about splitting a point of view, but that's not what we're addressing here. I'm asking you for, when we talked about this, what was this the example of? When we talked about the heroine, this was the example of a modern conception of fragmented subcultural spheres with more diverse desires and interests than previous. So, hopefully that clears things up. I know I went through it kind of fast, so if you have any specific questions, please email me. But most of you did very well, and I'm super happy with it this time around. You did all receive a curve, however, which honestly makes sense with the fact that we didn't get a review day to refresh everyone's minds in the same way, and that you were expected to review on your own like you do for most classes. Also, we did, regardless of how well people did, we did have most people procrastinate. I expected that. However, I think it's important for you to remember that if you didn't take that exam 2 and you've been spending this time really focusing on trying to get ready, prepare for exam 2, that we now have another exam, like not this coming week, but the week after, right? This is all we have left, because the past 2 weeks we have been preparing for exam 3, right? And so I would take a day if you're behind, and obviously you cannot retain information without a break, but I would take a day to, the benefit of that, honestly, is that now with these videos, you can watch them all in one day, right? Watch a video, take a break, watch a video, take a break, and you can start to more easily, since they're available to you instead of across weeks at a time. They're available, it's like binge watching, right? The narrative is going to be able to come together much more cohesively since we're not taking breaks, and hopefully you'll take advantage of that. Definitely get caught up as soon as you can. The best way to study for my classes, hopefully it's very apparent, is first of all, anytime I say this is a great example of a question, put a star by it, because it's probably going to be a distinction you need to know. In fact, all of these are distinctions, are things that I have said out loud you need to know, right? Always write down those. B, B, you have to, because even though we're trying to pin down little terms and create little distinctions, the world does not operate and it doesn't have neat definitions. It only has tendencies, right? And those are also things that we've pinpointed as patterns as humans. They're not real, right? And so hopefully you can, if you can start seeing this historical period as a narrative that flows and based on some of the things that we've had in the past, that makes sense, right? Then a lot of these questions you can intuitively kind of know the answer to, because you're like, oh, I have that story in my head. I know what kinds of things these people tend towards, whatnot. The other thing I would suggest is, hopefully you guys know this, but the reason I allow you, first of all, it's a history class, which means that there's a lot of material. It's a narrative structured type of story, right? So the reason the reason you have a time is obviously because I want you to know the bulk of this material. If I'm saying something in a video that says you need to know this, that's something that needs to be committed to memory, that so that you can easily click the button like I've done here, right? And then move on to the next one. However, I don't expect you to be able to master it all, but I do hope you know the function of Google, right? For like, you're at your computer. This is why you're allowed to take it remotely, is that I do expect you to be able to use Google very quickly. None of the questions are phrased in ways in which you can immediately type in, right, and get the answer. All of this class is based on the way that we've defined it through film theory and whatnot specifically. So you're never going to be able to find the answer, but you can find different like contextual clues very quickly on the internet as well. The other thing is that you can hit Control F. Hopefully all of you know that as well. So if you haven't printed out your notes and like, which the reason I suggest you to print out your notes now, you could also type it, right? You could also type. Make sure that in every section that I've said something that is committed to the lecture, but not explicitly mentioned in the notes. But in the lecture is the distinction where you need to note for the exam. Put it in the area of the notes that it belongs to. But if there is something being explicitly asked, like so many of these questions, at least half of them were not like distinctions or things that we went over. They were literally just things taken directly from the notes. You can hit Control F, type in a keyword, find the section very quickly for what you're looking for, and then start reading through there, and it'll start coming back to you, hopefully, once you start reading. So those are my suggestions. I hope this has been helpful, and I will be making another video very, very soon for postmodern aesthetics. Talk to you then.